Well, I'm coming through to the end of a long haul here. Last night I managed to get a total of about 1 hour, 45 minutes sleep. And so if I fall asleep in my own talk, if someone could wake me at the end of the service so I'm not here on my own, that would be embarrassing. Just leave quietly. And I will do the best I can to speak in a tone for those of you who need extra sleep as well, to be able to catch up on what you've been missing. This, as we've alluded to, there are three big overall questions we've been looking at during the course of this weekend, and the final one will be tonight. Now, on Saturday night, we looked at the issue of suffering from the fact that Christians would maintain that we live in a fallen world. In other words, that something has definitely gone wrong in this world, and it has affected everything, us and the very environment in which we live. Now, this morning, in the first morning service, we actually started with a reading by Professor Richard Dawkins, in which he levels a complaint that Christians have basically the most barbaric and most morally repulsive understanding of the world. That whenever natural disasters occur, it's because God is punishing someone, and that's a central tenet of the Christian faith. And that to make matters even worse, they worship a God who was tortured on a cross, and that makes it even worse. And they somehow seem to revel in that as well. And so we just looked at a response to that particular charge. Now, what I would like to do this morning now, while I'm with you, is actually approach this question now from a very different perspective. And I would like to deal with it from the issue of meaning. Because the simple truth is that if we do believe and can find meaning in a particular context, it often provides the strength and the sustenance we need to see us through almost any challenge, regardless of the scale of the suffering that we see before us. In its absence, it makes everything futile. It makes even asking these questions, the kinds of questions we're dealing with, a pointless exercise. Now, it's interesting that in the postmodern philosophy, which was really, that term itself is now actually becoming quite old, in a world of deconstructionism and various other ideas, what we're basically trying to say at times in philosophy is, look, there is no point to asking these questions. Okay? You're actually causing yourself even more angst, more suffering by asking these kinds of questions than you would be if you just simply left them alone. Okay, so just leave the questions alone. There is a story, I don't know if you're familiar with it, when it first came out, a novel, very famous novel, when it was first published, it was called The Diary of Antoine Roquentin. And this diary, that was published by a French author, told the story of this guy who is struggling with this whole question of meaning. And he's trying to figure out why the world is the way it is. And he finds it exceedingly difficult. And then one day he's sitting on a slope and he's looking at a chestnut tree. And as he sees the chestnut tree, he thinks to himself, I've got it. He has a moment of epiphany as far as he's concerned. He finally feels he has now actually got it, because he's asking the question, what's the point of a chestnut tree? They grow these horse chestnuts, but what do you do with them? What's the point of all of this? And then written into this diary is this line, and without formulating anything clearly, I understood that I had found the key to existence. Okay, so here's this guy, he's looking at a chestnut tree, and now he's finally found the key to existence. Do you want to hear what it is? Yes. This is what he says, that the world of explanation and reason is not the world of existence. Now, what on earth does he mean by that? What he's saying is this, look, there is one world where we look for reason, meaning, justice, purpose, truth. But that world only exists in your head. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It only exists in your imagination. And over here, we have the world of existence. Just brute, physical existence, where there is no meaning. There is no explanation. There is no justice. There is no truth. Things just are. And the trouble is that the world that exists in our head is trying to impose itself on the real world. So we've got this world that exists only in our mind, where we're asking questions about why and truth and meaning and justice and purpose. And we're trying to force it to make it fit onto this world of existence, and it doesn't fit. These are two separate worlds. And the question is, which one do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world that exists only in your mind, but you can rationalize, and you've got truth and meaning and justice and all those other kinds of things, purpose, and you can be happy? Or you want to live in the real world of brute physical fact and existence? And that is it. And stop asking these stupid questions about why, because there are no answers to them to be found. Which world do you want? Now, this is why, at one point in the 60s, one of the very famous British existentialists, he told the story of a man who was a one-eyed king. Now, there's a very famous saying that comes out of this book. In the country of the blind, they say, the one-eyed man is king. Now, because we've taken it out of context, we've understood this to be sometimes to be a metaphor of power. That if everyone else is blind, and you only have one eye, and that eye is partially sighted at best, you can basically take advantage of everyone around you. But that's not exactly the purpose behind that novel as it was first written. Here's the scenario that's painted for us. You are living in a country where everyone is blind. No one can see anything. And they think they can see. They talk about seeing. They actually think they can. You, however, are partially sighted, but you have partial sight in one eye, and you can see enough to see that everyone else is blind. What do? Do you go around bursting people's bubble? Pop. Listen, you can't see. You're blind. Okay, you're fooling yourself. You haven't got a clue what's going on. And you make them miserable. Or do you let them believe that they can see? And they're happy. And wrong. What do you do? When I first became a Christian and started traveling around the world, sometimes people would say to me, Michael, I'm so happy for you that you're a Christian. I wish I could believe what you believe, but I can't. And I can remember after hearing that about 4 or 5 different times in different countries, I began thinking, what does this mean? And what they're basically saying is, Michael, you actually seem to be a very happy and contented person. And we actually know from our psychological studies that is increasingly rare. In the World Health Organization Mental Health Survey of 2000, which were the published results of which were written up in 2004 or analyzed partially in the American Journal of Health, we discovered that in North America, I think it was 26.7%, if I remember correctly. It's always dangerous to recall these statistics after 1 hour, 45 minutes sleep. 26.7% of American population right now are suffering from mental distress. Right now. That means if you came here with 3 friends and they seem to be okay, guess who's in trouble? Now, to make it worse, a similar percentage had suffered mental distress within the previous 12 months. That's half the population. And so what people are saying, Michael, I'm so happy for you, I wish I could believe what you believe. What they're saying is, look, you seem to be a relatively happy guy. And that's great. I am happy that you are happy. Okay, but the reason why you are happy is you believe in Jesus. You believe in something that isn't there. Now, what do we call people who believe in things that don't exist? Mad people. So what they're saying is you are insane. But the main thing is you are happy and insane. Now, I am happy that you are happy. I'm so desperate to embrace happiness, I too would embrace insanity just to join you. I wish I could, I've thought about it, but I can't. What do you do with these two worlds? And as Antoine Roquentin looks at this scenario, he feels this deep sense of absurdity arising within him. Camus wrote about it, the absurdity between our desire for harmony, justice, reason, truth that exists within us, and the complete irrationality, injustice, and lack of truth in the real world. And as Antoine Roquentin looks sitting at this tree, concluding that his mind is trying to impose meaning on a world which has none, he begins to feel sick. Physically, emotionally, spiritually sick. Sick to the pit of his stomach. Which is why, when this novel was first translated into English and published for the first time in English in North America, the editor republished it with a new one-word title, Nausea, by Jean-Paul Sartre. Because that one word summed up the heart of the book. That this is what it's like. Now, when we come into the question of suffering, therefore, and even Christians raise this question, we say, how are we able to make sense of it? Now, because in the previous 2 talks I've tried to deal with a rational framework of how there might be a God of love and suffering, and one doesn't exclude the other necessarily, here I'm going to take things in a slightly different track, but we are going to come back to one very, very big question, which is, Why does God intervene when he does and not at other times, and why doesn't he intervene more? Why doesn't he just stop this stuff? And couldn't he have created a better world in the first place? Where tectonic plates don't bump into each other, for instance. Isn't that possible? And these are great questions. And I'm going to preach my message, and then next week the pastor of this church, Matt Hurd, will come and answer those questions for you. Now, there are lots of things that reinforce this idea of randomness, meaninglessness. And of course, many of those do come from science. That we're all basically simply a product of chance. And what's more, we actually live in a rather cosmically empty and cold universe. I mean, there's a huge amount of space out there. So much space that we like to speculate and wonder whether we're all alone. And if you've seen the film Contact, which was quite an old film now, but I'm getting older, more well-covered, happier. There's the line that we hear all the time, it's an awful waste of space if it's just us. I was speaking a few years ago in South Africa. As a matter of fact, I'm going to South Africa myself. It's one of my favorite countries in the world. And as you were just hearing from the lady in one of the other locations who's helping lead worship, it is an amazing place to go and actually just be part of the church, because the dancing is phenomenal and you just can't help join in. And I like nothing more than taking Episcopalians and Presbyterians to South Africa and just seeing what happens when they're inexplicably moved. I have video of some of them, and it's why our ministry is so well funded. Now, but I can remember one of the first times, actually the second time I was speaking in South Africa. I'd spoken the first time, and I'd spoken at the University of Cape Town, UCT, which is one of the leading universities on the entire continent of Africa. And we had good numbers. We had about well over 1,000 people coming by the end of the series, with 1,500 every talk. As a matter of fact, I can remember for one of the talks, the overflow of 800 people filled up 1 hour, 20 minutes before the meeting began. And so we did a second series of meetings in a large auditorium for about 5,000, 6,000, and I did it with a guy called David Block. Now, David Block is an astronomer. He has access to astronomical telescopes, and he specializes in studying what are called cosmic pillars of dust, which, when I saw, are some of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Now, without a shadow of doubt, he is the most eccentric academic I've ever met in my entire life. And I live in Oxford, in England. So that's really saying something. I've got a pretty high benchmark. And behind him, as he was speaking, he had a screen. Now, behind me, there's a screen. The screen was roughly double the size of this one. So it was a big screen. And he brought with him a projector, which cost tens of thousands of dollars, to show the slides. Now, I imagine everything's digitized now, but he had these special slides taken with these astronomical telescopes, and he was projecting it up onto the wall while he was speaking. Now, the first slide he put up was just filled with stars. And he just said, do you know how many stars are on this slide? He said, if you were to count the stars on this slide at the rate of 1 a second, it will take you 2,800 years. And I can remember thinking, wow, you must be really old. Or you have a computer. Now, the next slide he put up was of one of these cosmic pillars of dust. It was incredible. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it in my life. And he says, this is a cosmic pillar of dust. And he walked up to the screen, and coming from this huge pillar, this big central thick thing, there was this little wisp, this little bit breaking away from the main trunk. And he came and put his fingers on it, and he said, you see the distance from here to here on this giant screen? He said, that's the distance across our own galaxy. Then he put up another slide. It looked very much like the first slide, millions of pricks of light. He said, you see all these pricks of light? He said, every prick of light you see on this screen is not a star, it's a galaxy. And then he put up a giant empty square. It was like this, just a box. And then he held out a pen, and he said, if I were to ask you to pictorially represent the significance of your existence in relationship to the size of the universe, how would you draw it? Now, have you ever felt very small? I remember I was sitting in the auditorium thinking, 1, how am I going to follow this presentation? And 2, I'm going to need counseling. He said, if you took, now in England we call them compasses, you draw circles with them in mathematics, it's called a compass. He said, if you took a compass, the metal end, the sharp bit, and you just walked up to the screen, he said, and you just put the tiniest hole in it, you would feel that you are overstating the significance of your existence in relationship to the size of the universe, wouldn't you? And I think this is making it worse. Now, at this point, he broke off in his presentation. And he started explaining that we're all carbon-based life forms. I know this to be true because I've seen Star Trek. And then he went on to explain things I don't understand about strong and weak electromagnetic forces and nuclear forces and all other kinds of forces. And then he asked a very interesting question. He said, carbon only exists in a universe when these forces are held in a certain equilibrium. And the universe that we exist in is exactly the type of universe size it needs to be to allow the existence of just one carbon-based life form. And I can remember thinking, I'm so glad I'm not alone. And then he asked the next question. How significant are you in relationship to the size of the universe? And back up came his big square, and there was a stick man in it that filled it from top to bottom. And he said, the universe is the precise size it needs to be to give us existence. And then quoting a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Jastrow, he said, we should not be surprised to observe a universe so large. We couldn't possibly exist in a universe that was any significantly smaller. Is it possible? And I realize that this is exceedingly radical, and even for those of you who are sitting here and are Christians, you may need to think about this, because we're going to be asking some very profound, and I have to say some very difficult questions. But the question we are dealing with is a very difficult question. There are no simplistic answers. But is it possible that God has designed a universe that allows you to exist because he wanted you? And the person sitting next to you, and your ancestors, and your ancestors' ancestors, and so on. That's where all of this is going. We live in a world, and we look at it, and we think, but why is it like this? Is it just chance? Does that explain it? Because then that by definition eliminates meaning. And maybe Christians are just people who are very good at seeing meaning, making connections where there is none. You know the story of a pastor who had a cat? Tall, thin guy, ginger hair. And he had a family, and they had a little cat. There was got left, and they had to look after it. So a member from the church went away, said, "Will you please look after my cat?" Reluctantly, they said yes. Anyway, one day, the father, he's at home watching one of the big games. His kids, they're back from break. One of them sticks his head out the window and then leans over and taps his dad on the shoulder and says, "Dad, the cat that we're looking after has just climbed to the top of one of the trees in our garden, in our yard." And they come out to the yard, and sure enough, there's a very tall, thin, spindly tree, and right at the top, there's this cat. So the kids, they look at the cat, they look at their father, he's a pastor, he can solve anything. They say, "Dad, what are you going to do?" So the father thinks, and within a second, he says, "I have a plan." He says, "I'm going to get my truck and a piece of rope. I'm going to make a lasso. I'm going to lasso the top of the tree. I'm going to take the rope, I'm going to tie it to the back of the truck. And as I drive along, the tree is thin. It will bend down to the ground. Eventually, it will be close enough to the ground, one of you can reach up and you'll be able to take out the cat." And they go, "Dad, you're a genius." He lassos the tree, he ties the back of the rope to his truck, he starts driving along. He's driving, the tree is bending. He's driving, the tree is getting lower, lower, lower. The rope snaps, the tree springs upright, and the cat is launched into the air. Now, 2 weeks later, he's visiting some friends. They've just recently moved into the neighborhood, they've joined the church, he just wants to come and say hello. He knocks on the door, his wife has given him a pie to deliver. He opens the door, and as he's handing over a pie, he looks down at the floor, and there is the cat that he was asked to look after. The lady of the house ushers him inside to meet the husband and offers him a cup of coffee, and as he sits in the lounge, now with a piece of the pie that he brought, the cat walks in, and he just looks at the cat, and he looks at the couple, he says, "That's a nice cat. Have you had it long?" And the lady says, "Pastor, you're not going to believe this. I was in my garden 2 weeks ago. I was in the yard. I was raking the leaves. My 6-year-old son came to me and said, 'Mummy, please can we have a cat?' And I said, sweetheart, we've talked about this before, we've talked about it with your father. The answer's no. He goes, please. He said, Pastor, he kept begging me, and eventually I just lost it, and I said to him, okay, son, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get on our knees right now and ask Jesus for a cat. If he wants you to have one, he will send you one. Pastor, you will not believe what happened next. Now, is this what Christians are guilty with on a cosmic scale? Reading patterns into things which are ultimately meaningless. It's just coincidence, it's just the way it is. We're just looking for patterns, we're looking for connections where they don't exist. So we wrongly conclude that this universe is designed. It looks that way, and most of the atheists will say, you know, a cursory glance at the evidence, you may well conclude that, but if you look carefully, you'll conclude that it isn't. After all, if you give enough monkeys typewriters, eventually they'll produce the works of Shakespeare. Have you ever heard that one? I had the privilege of spending some time with a man called Anthony Flew a few years ago. He died just shortly. Anthony Flew was very, very famous in the sense that his philosophical essay on theology and falsification was the most widely reprinted philosophical essay of the 20th century. When he was a student at Oxford, he debated a guy called C.S. Lewis and won. So he was considered to be exceptionally bright, and he was a very gifted atheist. At one point, if you went to the Secular Society's website, you would have seen that his book on epistemology, on truth, on philosophy, how do we know what is true, how do we know what isn't true, was the basic recommended textbook for skeptics. And indeed, when I met with him, he explained to me how actually Richard Dawkins and various others had actually sent their books to him for his editorial advice as a philosopher and an atheist about whether they were making any philosophical mistakes, and also to be coached and trained by him. And he debated many, many Christians through his time. Now, one of the illustrations that he helped make famous was, if you give enough monkeys typewriters, eventually they'll produce the works of Shakespeare. That was his line. Now, a few years ago, his life made front-page news in the UK, and in all the Sunday papers, because he published a book in which he said, there is a God after all. I was wrong. It's not a very big book. It's called There Is a God, by Anthony Flew. If you're interested, F-L-E-W. It tells the story of his life, more or less. And in it, he recalls what happened one day when he was debating someone. And this person said, you know the whole thing about the monkeys and the typewriters? He said, yes. He says, do you know that a research grant was given to a group of students who put a typewriter in a cage of 6 monkeys and left it there for a month to see what the results were? Now, apart from using it as a toilet, they produced 6 typed pages, but not one single word. Which is all the more incredible when you consider the shortest word in the English language is A or I. However, to qualify as a word, it has to be separated by spaces. So if you have only 30 keys on your typewriter, and most have more, but if you have 30, the chance of randomly generating a one-letter word, therefore, is 1 in 27,000. Now, this got Flew thinking. Forget about reproducing the works of Shakespeare. How much effort is needed to reproduce randomly one Shakespearean sonnet? Now, Shakespearean sonnets are by definition 14 lines long. Let's take, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? There are 288 characters in that sonnet. The chance of randomly producing a Shakespearean sonnet on this basis is 1 times 10 to the power with 690 zeros after it. Now let me try to explain to you how big a number that is. If you take all of the known mass in the universe and break it down into particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons, and count them, at our best guess, there are 10 to the power of 80 particles in the known universe. If you were to take all of the mass in the universe and break it down, there aren't enough particles on which to write down the trials. Now, however, let's suppose we work with a different model. You take all the mass in the universe, everything, you, what you're sitting on, everything that exists, everything that we think is out there, and we convert it into microchips. Every microchip weighs 1/1,000,000 of a gram. Every microchip 1 million times a second produces random combinations of 288 letters, and let's assume that these computers have been running since time itself began. You would have randomly produced 10 to the power of 90 random trials. The universe would have to be 10 to the power of 600 times older than it currently is on this basis to randomly produce one Shakespearean sonnet. Now, most of you don't know what 10 to the power of 600 is. That's such a big number. You need to find a derivative trader or someone who works for a hedge fund. They'll explain it to you. Now, this doesn't prove, by the way, that God created the universe. This is not an argument for existence. It's just to say that that illustration, which so easily captivates our mind, is deceptively simple. It is far more complicated than we may initially think. And what happened for Flew, you can read it in his book, is when he saw all of this and had a debate with this guy, he thought life is far more complicated than a Shakespearean sonnet. And it set him on a journey. What happens if we're not here by chance? What happens if there is a God who put us here? Now, here's the problem. But wait a minute. We see all this stuff happening around us, and it's terrible. Wars, famines, earthquakes. So how on earth does this square? How do we understand this? Now, I've addressed elements of this in the two previous talks, but here's the bit I'd like to pick up now, and this is actually very, very difficult, so you may need to think hard. If you haven't had any coffee this morning, just zone out now. You'll be fine. When we think of ourselves in a better universe, I mean, a better one than this one, or in a better family, the mistake we make is that we think that we would actually be there. Now, let me try to explain what I mean. My mother, I can remember, when I was 6 years old, we were living in a small house in Reading. And I think I was roughly 6 years old. And I got talking with my mother, and I was asking the kinds of questions about, where did I come from? And so, they were explaining it to me as best as they could. Now, if you are confused about this, again, the pastor will explain it to you with diagrams. But basically, I was being explained, well, look, there's your dad, and there's me, and there are eggs, and there are sperm, and, the two come, whatever. And then I said, well, why did you marry him? Now, I love my father. At this point in life, he had a very big, bushy beard that I found prickly. Now, the strange thing is when he shaved it off, he came into my bedroom, I actually screamed and thought we were being burgled by somebody. But that's another story. So I wasn't keen on the beard. And my mother said, well, I knew other boys. There was one boyfriend I had who owned a castle. And he drove a Rolls Royce. I was like, wow. I was so excited. He said, my father, your father, the first time he took me out on a date, and this will tell you everything you need to know about English romance and explain why it's completely dead. He picks up my wife, my mother, for their first date, in a car that has no floor in it. It's rusted out. So as she sits there, she can actually see the road passing between her feet. So when it was wet, she actually had to hold newspaper over it, or between her legs just to stop herself getting wet from the spray coming up from the road. They arrived at the cinema. He went up to the booth, brought one ticket, then turned around and said to her, well, aren't you coming? Aren't you going to buy your ticket? And I listened to this story, and I was like, you should have married the guy with a castle. Then I would be living in a castle, and we'll be driving around in a Rolls Royce. And my mother said to me, yes, but you wouldn't be there. And I'm thinking, of course I'll be there, I'm your son. But I wouldn't be there. That's the whole point. I wouldn't be there. The reason I am me is a combination of the fact that my parents got together and produced me. That's what made me me, genetically. Any other combination doesn't produce me, it produces someone else. Enough random variations, and eventually it'll produce someone like Larry, who's working with me, who's down here at the front. Or my brothers. Actually, that explains a lot. The reason why you are you, and the reason why you have the character that you do, and you are the person you are, is a combination of your genetics, your culture, your spiritual walk. That is what makes you you. Now, here's what's complicated. If you go back 100 years and you stop a particular event, you change everything after that event. All of it. Different people survive. Different people get married. They produce different infrastructure, and the whole thing just ripples down. You see, the mistake we make is we think, look, we can just change this world and we will be here, and everything else will be changed around us. And maybe, in a good day, God will eliminate all the people we don't like. Which one of my colleagues called L.T. Jayachandran, he did this experiment once with a group of businessmen in Asia. He asked them to imagine peace. You know what they all imagined? They had 2 minutes to imagine peace. When they opened their eyes, he said, what did you see? They described snow-capped mountains, fields covered with flowers, lakes. All of these pictures had one thing in common. There were no people in them. Which is interesting when you think, when we want to create peace, the first thing we do is eliminate everyone else. Now, when we think of ourselves in a better world, we change the circumstances and maybe even various people around us. Here's the trouble. You wouldn't actually exist in that world. Someone else would. Now, these are very, very profound thoughts. Our ministry has just hired a new young guy called Vince Vitale. Vince is arguably one of the most brilliant philosophers I've ever come across in my entire life, and has won more international prizes in philosophy than anyone else I know. As a matter of fact, when I interviewed him to be part of the OCCA to teach for us on the program that we run in Oxford University on Christian apologetics, I actually said to Professor Brian Leftow, who has the chair of philosophy of religion at the University of Oxford, so this is one of the most prestigious chairs in the field, in the world, and I said to him, well, what's the significance of all of these prizes? And he pointed to 2 of them and said, well, I wasn't actually bright enough to apply for those 2 prizes because they're international and my grades weren't good enough even to apply, to be shortlisted for them. This guy is bright. He's also a very passionate evangelist. And he's just finished his doctorate, 3 years at Oxford University, answering this question, and only this question: suffering and identity. It is much more complicated than we think. Now, 2 weeks ago, Vince and we gave a week-long series of lectures at the University of Oxford and took Q&A at the end of each one. We did 5 lunchtime talks between us, and I also did 3 evening talks. If you email our organization, I'll send you the link for the talk he gave at the University of Oxford on Thursday lunchtime on this one question. I actually think it's one of the strongest presentations I've ever seen in this field. And you can listen to the Q&A afterwards, because there's plenty of Q&A afterwards. I have to warn you, I do think it's an unusually powerful talk. Several people became Christians as they sat and listened to it. This question is harder than we think. It's harder. It's more difficult. Let me read to you this passage from Scripture. And I've done something very stupid. I don't know what time I'm meant to finish. It's 12:27. Was I meant to finish 10 minutes ago? What time do we finish? 12:25? I've got an hour. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the most unpopular man in the church. What was it? 12 or 13? We're going to finish. Okay, let me read this and we'll just start drawing this to a close.
You've got 10 minutes.
I've got 10 minutes? I'm taking that as an evangelistic 10 minutes. Let me read to you from Ephesians 1. This is what it says. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in the heavenly realms with every spiritual blessing in Christ. For he chose us in him, before the creation of the world, to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us to be adopted as his sons through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given us in the one whom he loves. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace, that he lavished on us with all wisdom and understanding. And he made known to us the mystery of his will according to his good pleasure, which he purposed in Christ to be put into effect when the times have reached their fulfillment, to bring all things in heaven and on earth together under one head, even Christ. I realize this is exceptionally radical, but I'd like you to think about it. What if God wanted you? He wasn't creating the best of all possible worlds. He was creating the only world in which you would exist, and in which your parents would exist, and in which your grandparents existed, and your ancestors before them. Supposing he wanted them. Supposing God wanted to set in place a world in which every generation, in every part of the world, there are people who he has chosen because he wants them, because he loves them. You see, it's so easy to say, but if you'd only changed this. But that's the whole point. Every generation asks that question, and as soon as that happens, everything does change. Now, here's the incredible thing. God does intervene in this world. He does step in. And he does direct its steps. And it's because he wants you. Now, these are very tough things. I can't pretend to know more. Is it possible that we didn't have to have moving plates? To be honest, I don't know. It's very hard for me to second guess him. I just have to be honest. I wish I knew. The only things I can be sure of as a Christian that I feel I have insight into are the things that I read here. The rest of it is speculation, and the trouble with hypothetical questions is that they're hypothetical. And if you're a parent and you get asked lots of hypothetical questions, I'm telling you, it drives you up the wall. Because you don't know. I don't know. But what if it's the case he wants you? He does intervene in this world. Maybe this is the only world in which we could have existed. I haven't met him yet. There's a man who's asked if he could meet with me. I don't know if he regularly comes to the church. I think he does. He's a quadriplegic in a wheelchair. What if God wanted him? Loves him? You see, we may say it would have been better for him not to exist. And I'm sure that whatever pain and disappointment he's experienced in his life, and I'm sure there is much. What if God loves him? Even though we may feel embarrassed to look upon people who are in that position. What if God loves them, wants them, knows them? And what if this world is not the end? What if we're only here for 70 years, 70 years and 10? What if this is simply the world where we respond to him? And we will spend an eternity with him, because he doesn't want us just now. He wants us forever. Well, that's what the gospel is about. I don't have time to go into all of this, but maybe this is a man you may even want to invite down here one day. I have a spiritual mentor in the name of a man called Tom Tarrance. He was on America's 10 most wanted list. When Edgar Hoover was the joint head of the CIA and the FBI, at the age of 21, I think he was 21, he was on that top 10 most wanted. That's what we call success at an early age. I don't have time to tell you his whole story. He ran the most successful terrorist cell in North American history. So successful that Edgar Hoover eventually decided he would have to have him killed. This was slightly controversial. The CIA is not meant to kill American citizens on American soil. But there are many things they're not meant to do. And just in case you're listening today, I'd like to say how much I respect you. Now, Hoover set up an operation to have this guy killed. He was on his way to drop off a bomb at someone's house, Jewish man's house. 26 sharpshooters had been appointed around the building. What Hoover did is he removed the team that were working in the United Nations. Now, some of you are too young to know this, but there used to be this organization called the KGB that sort of still does exist, but that's a whole other story. They were the Secret Service in the Soviet Union. Well, there was a team working in the UN who'd been trained to identify KGB units operating in the UN, infiltrate them, and turn them around to become double agents for the US government. Hoover removed that team from the UN, sent it off to go and find Tom Tarrance and infiltrate his organization. They infiltrated it. They were good. They were trained. And as he's walking to the house carrying a bomb in his hands, 26 sharpshooters opened fire. Now, amazingly, he made it back to his car, which does suggest that some of these men needed more training. He got in his car, he drove away. As he drove away, vehicles came out from everywhere. Basically, they'd hidden in garages all around and chased him down the street. Now, if I remember correctly, 367 rounds of ammunition were fired. Eventually, his car came to a standstill, which I guess is a testimony to American engineering. He grabbed the Uzi on the seat next to him, and as he got out of the car, he sprayed the car behind him with bullets. Now, one officer saw what was happening. He ducked behind the door. The second officer, he was turning on the heel, and he took a bullet straight in the chest that went into his heart, and he collapsed. When his clip emptied, the first policeman stood up and shot him twice with a shotgun. But then instead of coming to finish him off, as were his orders, this man went to his partner, beat his chest, and got his heart beating again and saved his life. And in that moment of confusion, Tom escaped. He went and hid in a bush. They came with flashlights. They came with dogs. They found him. They turned the flashlights off and they opened fire at point-blank range. When they turned their flashlights on, he was still breathing. One of them produced a pistol, held it to his head, and at that point an ambulance crew arrived. Now, if you want to hear his testimony in full, then when I had the privilege of speaking with him at the Annapolis Naval Academy, I know that was recorded for an hour, and you could download it if you Google him. Okay? Just look for cslewisinstitute.org. The ambulance crew carried him away. Everyone was sure he was going to die. Well, he didn't die. He got better. He went to trial. There was a big scandal. He was put in a maximum security prison in Alabama. He was there for 6 months, decided he didn't like the accommodation the American government were giving him, and he left. He rejoined his old unit, not knowing it had been infiltrated. He was recaptured. Put back in jail in solitary confinement, given an extra 5 years, and Hoover recommended he should spend every single day in solitary. He was allowed out once a week for 20 minutes. While he was in prison, he started reading all kinds of violent literature. And after a couple of years, because he was a good Southern Baptist, he asked if he could have a Bible. He started reading it. And he suddenly realized that he was a sinner. For the first time in his life, he realized that what he'd been doing was wrong. He got down on his knees, he invited Christ in his life, and God completely turned his life around. The change was so dramatic, everyone heard about it, including Edgar Hoover. And if you know your history, you'll know that Hoover heard about everything in those days. Hoover sent the agent who masterminded that program to interview him and send him a report on what had happened. That agent went on to write his own book. He says from the moment he walked into the cell, he knew that he was looking at a different man. So profound was the change in Tom Tarrance's life that the Jewish business community and the Jewish businessman who he was trying to kill in this particular operation set up a campaign for his early release. And when he was released, he toured around North America talking about racial reconciliation and equality, about how wrong he'd been and the things he had done. God not only loves us, and he wants a world in which you are here. He alone is the one who can actually step into our hearts to turn our lives around when everything else has gone horribly wrong. And that is the hope that we have. That is why I think we live in this kind of world. As complex as it is, and as hard as it may be. And he does intervene. And he wants to intervene in your life to set you in the direction that he knows that you should go in, where you can truly be you, to all of your ability and to all of his glory. That's one of the reasons why I'm a Christian. This is God's speciality. He loves rescue. Well, I forgot to realize what time I was meant to finish. I'll draw there. Some of you, I may never see you again. I realize that may be sweet news to you. I'd like to thank you for your hospitality, for your grace, for those of you who will be here tonight on the issue of arrogance. There'll be a lot of time after that service. I'll just stay around as long as it takes to try to answer as many questions as I possibly can. So whether you're here, or whether you're in one of the other locations, thank you so much for listening to me. It's been a privilege for me to be with you. And I pray that you will be able to spend time with him for the rest of this day, and indeed for eternity, as he's intended it. May God bless you.